Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be starting my season review series, and we're going to be going in reverse Constructors Championship orders. Of course, that means starting with the team that finished dead last in 10th in this year's Constructors Championship. So first taking a look at their drivers, Valtteri Bottas and Guang Yu Zhou, and kind of looking at their head-to-head stats. So first for the more qualifying, let's see if we can get this going. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so for the qualifying stats, this was a teammate head-to-head that was quite lopsided. So in qualifying head-to-heads, Bottas won 20 of them and Zhou only 3. Median qualifying gap between the two drivers, 0.482 seconds in Bottas's favor, which is the biggest gap that's been over their 3 years as teammates, and that's something that we'll definitely get into. In terms of average starting position, average finishing position, for Zhou, it was 17.75, for Bottas, 15.13. So Bottas, on average, starting about 2.6 positions ahead of his teammate Zhou. But when you look at how that translated into average finishing position, it actually was a little bit different. So for Zhou, average finishing position across the season, 15.23, Bottas 15.55. So despite the fact that Bottas was on average starting about 2 positions higher, Zhou was actually the driver that had the highest average finishing position, and this is even with removing sprint results. So for example, Zhou's 9th place finish in the sprint in China, that wouldn't be included in this particular stat. So again, it is a little bit interesting to see. And again, it does, I think, mean that, for example, the gap between the two drivers, at least in the races, was pretty small. Now, when we look at the drivers in the races, though, it is, again, a bit of an interesting picture. So for Zhou, of course, finished 20th in the championship, 4 points on the season. For Bottas, 22nd in the championship, no points. When you look at the race head-to-head, just looking at races where both drivers finished, Bottas still had the upper hand, winning that head-to-head 12-8. So even though Zhou had the highest average finishing position, Bottas did win the direct head-to-head there. And that kind of suggests to me that when Bottas finished ahead of Zhou, it was usually the gap was pretty smaller between the two of them, and it was a little bit lower. And when Zhou finished ahead of Bottas, there was maybe a couple cars in between. But regardless, the car was pretty terrible. And again, it didn't, at most races this season, it wasn't really in a place where it could really score points. And it was only really the last 3 or 4 races where it's even a possibility. And again, it took quite a bit of luck, as we saw in Qatar, for that to even happen. Now, taking a look at the results of my expected points model, for Zhou, of course, he massively overperformed here just because he was on average starting so much lower, and generally starting from positions that were very, very far outside of the points, and given the strength of the car as well. So points we have expected, 3.3. When you convert that to a percentage, 570%. Of course, very, very good. Of course, that's going to be helped a lot. Again, I do think it was a little bit more luck-based than purely a result-based metric there. For Bottas, negative 2.46. So again, he was expected to score 2.42, about 2 points or so, and of course scored no. And again, as a percentage, that's 0 points. Now, when you look at average power rankings and see where the two drivers end up on my power rankings over the course of the whole season, for Zhou, his average was 15.83, which ranked 21st out of 22 drivers. So it basically included all the drivers except for Behrman and Duran, as everyone else, I decided, didn't participate in enough Grand Prix. For Bottas, 13.75, so I felt a little bit better over the course of the season than Zhou, with that score ranking 18th out of the 22 drivers. Now, when you look at Bottas and Zhou as their time as teammates, of course, this is their third and, of course, final year as teammates together. When you look at the race model, that first year together, it was basically a score just over 2, and that was in Bottas's favor. So all these stats on this slide here are all going to be basically based on in Bottas's favor. But you can see for the blue line for the race model, it basically goes down and gets closer and closer over their 3 years. So again, Zhou basically caught up over those years. And of course, this year it was in the negatives from Bottas's perspective. Again, positive for Zhou between the average finishing position and between the points scored. Again, that's to be expected. But when you look at the qualifying gap, for example, over their first 2 years, his teammates basically hovered between 2 to 3 tenths of a second, again in Bottas's favor. But you can see that final year, it is basically a massive basically blip up to basically almost being half a second gap. So interesting to see why that gap magically showed up in the third year. Usually you would expect it to be the other way around. The first year his teammate would be the one with the big gap in qualifying, and then kind of gets a little bit closer to those last 2 years is what you would expect. So my guess is that Zhou, for whatever reason, just really didn't click with the driving style. He wasn't able to adapt his driving style to what the car needed in order to perform over one lap. It seemed to not be an issue in the races, but yeah, definitely seemed to be an issue in qualifying. All right, now taking a look at Sauber's team statistics, again, pretty ugly, as you would expect for a 10th place team in the Constructors. Only 4 points, again, last, and again, much worse than last year. Average pole gap, 1.559 seconds, again, ranked 10th out of the 10 teams. An average minimum finishing position, which is a stat that I like to use to assess a team's race performance, 13.67, and again, last. Now, taking a look at the pole gap, and this is the 3 race moving average course across the course of this season. It is interesting to see, at what points in the season Sauber were best and what points they were weakest. So starting the season, they were actually better than Alpine for the first 5 to 6 races, I would say. Again, they were about 1.5 seconds off pole for those first races. Again, they improved a little bit, and then they had a massive drop in performance that was due to Monaco, and again that hurt their 3 race average there. But again, they weren't too awful. They were generally about like a second off pole for the first half of the season, which again is not too terrible, and they were kind of in the same ballpark as everyone else. It's really when we got to past the summer break, and they just fell completely off a cliff, as you can see by the green line in the graph, where they basically kind of go on a straight line from about 1.2 seconds off pole to about 2 seconds off pole, and they're basically just in no man's land by themselves. And they were unfortunately kind of in that position for most of the second half of the season, until you get to the final round, where they're basically competitive with the Williams, competitive with the Aston Martins over one lap. So yeah, interesting to see how they had such a massive fluctuation across the course of the season. Again, it'll be interesting to see how they do in 2025, of course, with a brand new driver lineup of Gabriel Bortoleto and Nico Hülkenberg. Now, breaking the, let's see, what is this? This is for the race performance through the season, broken up into quarters. So when you look at average finishing position, this is just average, so it doesn't use the minimum finishing position that I like to use instead. So for the average finishing position, you can see it's basically 15 for the first quarter, again about 15 the second quarter, drops to about below 16 to 17. So that's again when they were performing at their worst, right after the summer break, and then you can see a big improvement the final quarter of the season. And again, that kind of is represented in their points as well. First 3 quarters, no points, and then that last quarter, of course, they get all 4 points at Qatar. So again, points not super representative, but again, you can kind of see with the average finishing position how they again gradually get worse over the course of the season, and then got quite a bit better towards the end. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to keep that momentum up going into 2025. Now, when we look at Sauber's record the last 5 years, this is again average, minimum, best, starting position, finishing position. It is interesting to see how it's basically from 2020 to 2022 is general gradual improvement. The last 3 years since 2022, it's basically gone backwards in just a straight linear trend. And again, this year, for both average minimum starting position and average minimum finishing position, again, they basically, this year, I think they're trending close towards 13.5, again, the stat that I showed before. If you look at the disparity between qualifying performance and race performance, you can see, for example, in 2020, it was pretty big, and again, a large part of that was due to the really poor Ferrari engine that year. But again, basically since 2020, it's been pretty close between the two. So you can see the last 2 years, again, not great, and they've definitely been going in a backwards direction. So again, it'll be really interesting to see how they perform in 2025. Again, that will be their last year as Sauber before they basically rebrand into the Audi team. That being said, the team's basically already owned by Audi. It's basically going to be just a rebrand for 2026. Again, it should in theory be the Audi team in all but name at this point. So interesting to see how things will go for next year. I think expectations are going to be pretty low given how bad this year was. But again, 2 new drivers, I think that should inject some energy into the team. So there you go. There's my review of Sauber's 2024 F1 season. Again, not a great season. But again, I think they have some interesting building blocks. And of course, there'll be a works team for 2026. So again, that's, I think, really only positive. Unless the engine's an absolute dud and you're basically in a Maconda situation where you're miles off the back. And yeah, no one really wants to use your engines or drive your cars. So thank you so much for watching. That's my review of Sauber's 2024 F1 season. Again, next up will be Williams, who of course finished tonight. So thanks so much for watching, and goodbye.